And so what I'm going to be talking about today is the way delays are handled in the air traffic industry. And sort of to give you a sense of why we think this is a problem to be tracking. If you look at the effects on the U.S. economy, airline profit and losses in any given year over the last 10 years or so are in the somewhere cumulatively, maybe $5 to $10 billion range, is sort of the order of magnitude of their profit or loss. And if you look at the magnitude of delay costs on the industry in sort of any one of these years, for socially, they're in the $30 billion range, but in terms of direct costs to the airlines, it's in the $8 to $10 billion range. So sort of the costs imposed by handling delays due to bad weather and other things are more or less the same order of magnitude as the profitability of the industry as a whole. What does the industry do about this fact? So there's a number of things done. So there are, if you want, there are a lot of things that are done months out in terms of planning. So in many ways you can think of this congestion as basically a pollution problem. Basically there's just more demand for flights at airports than can be reasonably handled. In some cases this is true even when there's perfect weather and everything is right, there's still more demand than there's capacity. But other places are fine when there's good weather, but then when there's bad weather, there's an excess. So you can sort of view this as a pollution problem, and so you get the same sort of two natural solutions you get to pollution problems. So one is sort of a cap and trade like systems where there are maybe a limited number of slots permitted at an airport, and there are various mechanisms for determining who gets to have those slots. And then there are sort of the tax solution to it where something like congestion pricing basically says you can schedule as many flights as you like, but if you're scheduling them during the peak parts of the day, you're going to be charged a much higher cost for each flight that you have land to try to do sort of a disincentive and to take into account the costs you're imposing on the system as a whole. So there's these mechanisms that work in advance to try to cope with the problem. There are also things that happen day of, right? So when there's bad weather, suddenly, some flights will somehow get delayed or canceled. If you're sitting at the airport, you might discover that your flight has a 2-hour delay or it's been canceled. And what's going on behind the scenes, and I'll talk about this in more detail, is that the FAA in the US, in concert with the airlines, are doing various traffic flow management programs that involve basically holding airplanes on the ground before they take off in order to avoid congestion at destination airports. And then there are also some sort of real-time things that go on, basically having planes fly faster or slower to try to manage how many are showing up at a given time, or having a plane sit and circle at the airport for a while until there's available capacity to land. So the stuff I'm going to be talking about today focuses on that middle one, sort of the day of operations, where what we want to do is we want to hold some planes on the ground in order to make the available supply of landing slots and to land for them balance. And I'm going to be primarily talking about it at a specific airport, but this actually applies to crowded air sectors as well. So this problem can occur in the air as well as on the ground. And basically, what happens is that you might have had a plan where maybe an airplane was supposed to land every 2 minutes at some airport. And now because bad weather has tightened restrictions on what's safe to do, it might only be safe to have a plane land every 4 minutes. So even if the initial schedule of airplane landings was feasible, it's almost certainly now infeasible. There's just no way to have planes that are scheduled to land every 2 minutes fit into landing slots every 4 minutes. So somehow you have to reschedule things so that things are feasible. And what's been agreed upon as sort of fair by the industry is what they call ration by schedule. And basically what that does is sort of a first come, first serve. They just take the schedule and stretch it out. So whoever was supposed to land first still lands first, whoever was supposed to land last lands last, but now the schedule is just twice as long if we've gone from landings every 2 minutes to landings every 4 minutes. Right, so it's a very Very simple thing, everyone is treated equally. So sort of one reason they're able to come to agree on is fairness. But it's also probably going to be pretty clearly inefficient, right? We're not taking into account anything other than when you were originally scheduled in determining who gets the landing slots when bad weather strikes. So the actual picture is a little bit more complicated than that. So after that happens, so after that ration by schedule happens, we now get into this new situation where we have these allocated arrival slots. We have the people, airlines, flights have been given arrival slots. Then airlines have the ability to change around their operations. So what I can do is maybe if I have a flight assigned in slot 2 and I have a flight assigned in slot 14, I can just swap them. So I can have my flight that was assigned for slot 14 use slot 2 and vice versa. I can also just cancel one of my flights. So actually, when they say that your flight was delayed by 2 hours or canceled or something that's out of their control, that's actually not quite true. Really what they're doing is they're making some optimization decisions in this stage about what flights are going to get delayed or canceled based on what we're expecting for their operations. And then there's sort of a schedule that comes out and there might be some gaps in it. So there's sort of a procedure that goes through and squeezes it together in a feasible way. And this is potentially an iterative process where, now that there's a new schedule, airlines might want to respond again now that they see what's happened. Any questions so far on sort of the big picture? Okay.
Are there any legal constraints?
I would say, I don't think that there are any legal, so in some sense, the constraints on, how big the slots are in those situations, those are sort of legal in a sense because they're made by the FAA about what's safe and compliance with safety guidelines and things like that. The rules about, scheduling and things like this, these are, the constraints are, I would say, political rather than legal, right? So it's sort of, that is the official FAA procedure for how this is done, but the official FAA procedure is basically the result of the industry and the FAA working together and deciding what should be done in this situation.
So there must be some resource constraints, like the airplane is not in the air, so it has a little.
Yeah, so it's even, this picture is actually even more complicated than I described, right? So obviously you can't hold a plane on the ground if it's already in the air, and there are various ways you can get exempted, like often you're sort of just guaranteed your slot if you're already in the air and things like that. So there are, right, so while this initial slot allocation thing, there's a lot of complicated things that happen afterward, which is something to come back to a bit. So what do we want to do, and so what have people looked at? So as I said, sort of the primary constraints are political. So one of the things we want to do is we're not going to look at sort of first best type solutions to how to resolve the problem. We're sort of going to try to find a solution that's plausible and also very similar to current procedure, and then ask about how good this solution is. Because that's the sort of thing that we think actually has some hope of being adopted in practice. And there is some other work that have taken this ration by schedule and sort of come up with other notions of what might be fair or efficient or something, and looked at different ways you can do it. And certainly you can view us as in that spirit. Then there are people who have looked at better things you can do than just sort of this rationing procedure to allocate this row of slots. So the people looked at basically allowing airlines sort of expressive markets in which they can trade slots between each other rather than just shuffling their flights among themselves. There have basically been, this is a paper by Vazirani where he says basically, we should just basically use it as an auction. Basically, whoever wants to pay the most gets the first slot, and then on down, and just use payments to solve it that way. So certainly a thing we're going to be looking at is how we can achieve some of this improvement in the way delays are allocated, although we're going to be doing it with sort of as a more restricted approach than some of these. And then finally, a larger thing we'd like to do is we'd like to think think about whether the things we're doing on these day of operations can have beneficial effects into sort of the further out decisions in terms of reducing the overall congestion in the system. And so, this is, so the things people have looked at here are things like congestion pricing and these sorts of mechanisms. And so, while tools we're using are sort of very different from the tools we use, we'll see that, one of our things is we can actually recover some of these benefits, even though we're only working at sort of the day of operations.
So in these are like three possible methods, right? Three possible types of approaches. But what is the motivation? Have these papers sort of tried to give a motivation that, okay, this is the best way to do this?
Right. I mean, so some of them are purely, economic sort of first best type things. Like there's a large literature on congestion pricing that I have, a sample paper here, but there's a large literature of what would be the optimal way to price lots for things. Politically, the airlines say, we're an industry that loses money on a regular basis. You want us to pay more money? No, thank you. We're not interested in any regulatory scheme that involves this. And since there's a lot of regulatory capture involving the FAA, nothing is going to happen without sort of industry buy-in in that regard. There are also, some of these are more, looking at what would be sort of these smaller tweaks, what would be just sort of efficient in terms of some of them as well.
So going back to this example, so there are two remarks.
Mm-hmm.
One is that I think when you think of this one, my first thought was it sounded a bit like when you're reorganizing an organization, when you're trying to fire people,
Mm-hmm.
and who should you fire? There are principles usually, things like leave for last check, first out, or field, first last out, etc. And you seem to, you give the impression they are not normally by constraints in this problem.
Mm-hmm.
But if I think of transport settings, like train settings, there are usually rules like if you were more than an hour delayed, then you have to refund the fare. And those would probably be extremely important.
Right. Right. So there are. So certainly none of those are constraints on the allocation.
Yes.
But there are constraints on what might be a good allocation,
Yes.
and certainly that's one of the reasons this method is because it does sort of get some of those effects. But
that's not important in the way these things are done.
So we're going to take a simplified utility function for airlines when we get into some modeling later, but certainly those are things you would expect to be reflected in the utility function. That's the point I'll touch on.
I suppose like in scripture, is there like a concern about people making connections, for example? I mean, so
Yeah.
the default seems to be pretty good in terms of the incoming flight is late, but the outgoing flight is in the same order,
Yep.
so you don't mess up people's connections.
Yep, certainly. So
So
I'm
option is,
yeah. So that's definitely something that's factored in at least one portion of the talk, and I'll definitely talk about that.
What about risk? So when there's high congestion and stuff like that, or too many planes in the same area, then naturally the airports don't like things happening just because there's a higher risk.
Right. So I'm not. I'm only worrying about it in the sense that I'm assuming that sort of the risk is taken care of in the feasibility constraint. So if it's feasible, the risk is sort of within the acceptable limits, and indeed that's why when bad weather strikes, what becomes feasible involves fewer flights because they require much sort of tighter management to ensure safety. Okay, so I'm sort of going to use this in outline and go through each of these. And so the first part I'm going to talk about sort of what our proposed mechanism is. And sort of the key idea is we want something that's really close to this ration by schedule. It's the current sort of standard, and that it's not going to involve money. We don't want to sort of involve airlines making payments into it. And so all we do is add one word. So instead of ration by schedule, what we propose is ration by priority, the prioritized schedule. So ration by schedule says the order is just determined by what time you were scheduled to arrive. So in our proposal, you also have a priority, and you can interpret the priority in terms of minutes, and we basically just pretend you were planning to arrive your prioritized number of minutes earlier. So if you were scheduled to arrive at 12:10, and you have 10 minutes of priority, then we assume we pretend you were scheduled to arrive at 12 and just run ration by schedule. So, apart from the small tweak of adding priorities, it's almost identical, and for sufficiently small priority budgets, it's arbitrarily close to the current procedure. So that's sort of the basic idea, and just sort of to run through an example that illustrates some points. So we might have sort of 3 airlines and which have between them 5 flights, and the first airline might be given 12 minutes of priority for each flight, and the second 5 minutes of priority for each flight. And so sort of there's 2 things to note. Sort of one is that sort of these priorities can change the order of things, right? So if, so this flight, so originally the ordering of flights was A1, then B1, then A2, but with